Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. We're coming to you from the Joseph Walker Williams Community Center on Rosa Parks Boulevard in Detroit. This is the neighborhood where the 1967 rebellion began on this very day, July 23rd. Today's program is part of our One Detroit commitment to examine the city's most important issues. We'll reflect on what happened 50 years ago and how it impacts Detroit moving forward. We want to welcome our audience members and invite our viewers at home to comment on Facebook and on Twitter. We start with a closer look at the issues that sparked the uprising. The media partners in the Detroit Journalism Cooperative conducted a year-long investigation on the state of social and economic conditions 50 years later. The findings are published in a book titled The Intersection from Bridge Magazine. Joining me now are Lester Graham of Michigan Radio, journalist Bill McGraw, and Keith Owens from the Michigan Chronicle. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Lester, let's start with you. Talk about what we've learned about 50 years ago, 50 years later.
Well, I think one of the things that was surprising to a lot of us was this, as we looked at things like housing, poverty, education, and so forth, that in many cases, the black people of Detroit are in worse shape than the black people of Detroit were in 1967. There's one exception to that. There are better relationships with the police, but beyond that, things have not improved much and sometimes gotten worse.
Yeah. Bill, you were a young man in 1967 here in Detroit. You've been a journalist in this community for a really long time, almost since that point. Talk about the things that we've learned about ourselves over that 50 years based on what happened in 67.
Well, I think in 67, after what happened, people started paying attention to what was going on in Detroit, even beyond police-community relations, education, and that was the deindustrialization of Detroit. And I think until 67, it was operating at a lower level. Not everybody quite understood the impact of what happened in the 50s when Packard closed and Hudson closed and all those part supplier closed. So there was an economic crisis going on in Detroit at a kind of a lower level until 67 brought a lot of attention, I think, to everything going on in Detroit.
Yeah. Keith, you're the editor of the Michigan Chronicle, the newspaper that speaks to African Americans here in the city of Detroit. Talk about the things that you feel like we've learned about that community, our community, over 50 years based on what happened in 67.
Well, I think one thing we've learned, which is what we know, is that we're very durable.
Resilient is the word we always use, right?
Resilient is probably a better term. But I think that, following up on what Lester said, I mean, the problem is that there's a lot of focus, not to beat the dead horse, there's a lot of focus in terms of what's happening downtown, which we're very happy with. And there are good things that are happening outside of downtown, it's not just downtown, but there are still some things that are troubling the community, exception. The poverty rate is high, the illiteracy rate is very high, the number of jobs, the kinds of jobs that are available, the jobs that we anticipate will become available in the new economy. Too many Detroiters are not qualified for that. The school system is still struggling. And a lot of that is because of what happened in 67. There was disinvestment, there was disinterest, there was pulling away from that. And I think that when you talk about the effects, the overall effects of racism, and people understanding what that can really do. People, I think, sometimes understand racism is just, black folks, white folks don't like black folks, something like that. It's much more intense, much deeper than that. And I think that what Detroit has really kind of become a symbol of, unfortunately, is what intense, concentrated racism can do to an entire community. Yeah. And it's almost devastated the city.
Right. It's very complex. Lester, talk about what has happened over the last 50 years that reproduces these stats over and over again. Was there a period where things got better and they slipped back, or have we sort of stayed in the same place for that long?
I think what's happened is, starting in the 50s with, as Bill mentioned, the decline of industry, the increase in automation, white flight, and then after 67, increased white flight, and then as crime rose in the city, middle-class black flight, and so it left the city hurting in a way that it had never been before. Yeah. So I think it's been a tough road to hoe for Detroit for a few decades now.
Yeah. Bill, what do you make of the things that we're seeing now in Detroit, this sort of excitement and enthusiasm about the things that we're seeing in places like downtown and midtown? How does that relate to what is going on in the rest of Detroit?
Well, there was a lot of excitement about Detroit in 1967, too.
That's right.
People have probably seen, excuse me, the film clip of Mayor Kavanaugh singing Detroit's praises on a...
pitching us for the Olympics,
Well,
right?
a little earlier than that, exactly. And so, you know, there were some buildings built downtown in the 60s, and but I don't think that masked what was going on at the street level. Abuse of citizens by the police, the inequality. What's going on today? There certainly are a lot of very exciting things happening in Detroit, and but it's about 10 square miles, unfortunately.
Right.
And you know, so much of the rest of the city is still hurting and still struggling.
Yeah. Education in particular, Keith, has been something that we haven't gotten right, and that's now my entire lifetime in Detroit. We've really struggled with that. What are we doing wrong? What are we not thinking of to move this community forward on that front?
Well, that's a large question. I mean, there's an awful lot involved with that.
Yeah.
But I think that what we need to focus on basically is, number one, what education needs to be, what it needs to do, you know, both in terms of, it's obvious it needs to be more than just preparing for a job, but it needs to be connecting that to the jobs, where the jobs are going to be, and the condition of the schools right now. You know, and also I think we need to focus on what's going right. I mean, there are a lot of teachers who are working extremely hard, some excellent teachers, some excellent principals who are doing everything they can against tremendous odds. You know, I mean, working with children, doing everything they can. What they need is support. You know, I think from what I've seen of the new superintendent, it seems to be, I think he's saying some of the right things. You know, what needs to be focused on, focusing on, you know, public schools in terms of getting, you know, the resources that we need, the teachers. There's just so much that Detroit schools need. I mean, and once again, I think the thing that needs to be understood, I think everybody's not saying anything that hasn't been said before, but you can't say Detroit is back if the schools aren't back.
Right.
You know, if the children aren't back, the city's not back.
Right.
You know, and I think that needs to be understood.
Yeah. Lester, talk about the things that would cast us forward 50 years so that we're not sitting around in 2067 saying, oh, we haven't moved anywhere in another 50 years. What are the things that we really got to drill down on?
Well, the biggest thing is white people have to learn to talk about race in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
They have to understand why racial history in this country has caused the things that we have today. That's going to be tough.
That's a very tough nut to crack even now.
But you know, we talked about this 50 years ago when the Kerner Commission was appointed by President Johnson to look into the civil disturbances across the country. And the finding then was we're creating two societies, one white, one black, equal, separate and unequal, and we're still there, and that is something we've got to deal with. We've known about it for a long time, and if you've got an answer, I want to listen.
I don't. I'll leave it to you, Bill, to talk last about that point. You've a longtime member of this community. Are we seeing an opening to get that conversation started between black people and white people about this?
Well, you know, a lot has changed in 50 years, certainly. You know. And the discussion has changed in many ways too, but the Kerner Commission also said that the institutions and the reason that all these cities in America erupted in the 60s was because of white racism. And I think it's fair to say whites have been reluctant to accept that responsibility. Maybe there's at least a discussion about things like that, but I don't know how far into various communities it filters down.
Yeah. All right, guys, great work, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.